A few words on the hotel itself. The Metropol was opened in 1905. And when it opened, it was not only the best hotel in Moscow, it was the best hotel in Russia. In the tradition of the great grand hotels that were built across Europe and the United States from the 1890s into early 20th century, the Metropol is the size of a city block. It was built with the finest materials. It had a great palm court where tea was served. It had an American bar. It had shops on the ground floor that kind of went around the circumference of the building, which you could enter from the lobby or from the street outside. It had multiple restaurants, including a very high-end restaurant serving continental cuisine. But as I say, this would be true of any of the great hotels that were being built at that time throughout Europe and the United States. They were almost like universal spaces, obviously built to serve the great wealth that grew up out of the 19th century for the Vanderbilts and their ilk coming out of the United States as an example, but certainly for the wealthy in Europe as well, who were on grand European tours of one kind or another, and who had very high expectations of the hotels which they would stay at as they went from city to city to city. So this is really what the Metropol was like. The only difference between the Metropol and the rest of the grand hotels in Europe is that soon after it opened, 12 years after it opened, it found itself in the middle of a proletarian revolution. It was very much in the middle of things. At one point during the battle for Moscow, the hotel was bombarded. Every single window in the hotel was smashed by Bolsheviks who were trying to drive the Tsar's soldiers back out of the hotel, which the Tsar soldiers were using as a sort of an enforced environment where they could have snipers in the windows and shooting down on the public squares. So the hotel was very much a part of the revolution. In the aftermath of the revolution, the Bolsheviks kicked all the guests out, shoved all the fancy stuff aside, and claimed the hotel. Because the Bolsheviks in the aftermath of the revolution had a problem, which is that they moved the capital of Russia from St. Petersburg, where it had been for hundreds of years, back to Moscow. And when they did this, the problem they had was that Moscow did not have an infrastructure to support a modern government in the 20th century. So the first thing they did is they seized the three best hotels in the city, the Metropol, the Savoy, and the National, kicked out the guests, and began using those hotels as giant administrative buildings. They had some important party officials living in the hotels, but they emptied the ballrooms and were using them for speeches. They emptied the dining room at the Metropol and filled it with cots so they could keep a battalion of soldiers on site at all times. The first constitution of the new Russia in the aftermath of the revolution was written in Suite 217 of the Metropol Hotel, and it was ratified across the street at the Bolshoi. So shortly after the revolution, around 1922, really, the Metropol was no longer a grand hotel. Its life as a grand hotel had ground to a halt as it had become this giant bureaucratic building. And that's the way it probably would have stayed, except for an interesting thing that happened at the end of 1922, and that is that the major European countries, including England, I think, began to recognize the Bolshevik government as the official government in Russia. Now, it took the United States more than a decade to come around to that point of view. But most of the European nations, the great European nations, did recognize the Bolshevik government as the authoritative government in 1922. And that meant that at the end of that year, ambassadors began to show up in Moscow. Trade representatives began to show up in Moscow. Corporate executives from the biggest corporations in Europe and the United States began to show up in Moscow, eager to do business with the new regime. And pretty quickly, the Bolsheviks realized that if they let these sophisticated visitors from the West come to Moscow and they put them up in crummy proletarian hotels, those visitors would go back to London and Paris and New York with the news that the revolution was a mess, it was failing. So the Bolsheviks kicked all of the party people back out of the Metropol, reclaimed all of the environments in the hotel, and began restoring them back to their pre-war glamour. Suddenly, there was a uniformed doorman back out in front. There were bellhops. There was caviar and champagne served in the restaurant. And in the bar, there was an American jazz band that played on a nightly basis. So the old glamour and liberty of the hotel was restored for the benefit of these foreign visitors. Now, initially, it was just for the benefit of the visitors. And in fact, an ordinance was passed in the city of Moscow that forbid any Russian citizen from going into a foreign designated hotel or restaurant, of which the Metropol was basically example number one. So only the foreigners were benefiting from the luxury and the liberty inside the walls of the hotel. But over time, the Russian citizens, the Moscow citizens, began to reclaim the hotel. And the most important factor in that transition back to where the citizens of Moscow could get a glimpse inside the hotel was brought about by a financial crisis. In the aftermath of the revolution, Russia was way behind England, America, the rest of Western Europe in terms of modernization. And the Bolsheviks wanted to accelerate modernization in the country, to industrialize the country as quickly as they could, to bring it back into parity with the other great European nations. And this is what the 5-year plans were all about, the rapid industrialization of Russia. The problem was that Russia didn't have the expertise or the equipment to modernize. So what they did is they began to buy that expertise and equipment from Western Europe, from the United States, bring it in order to industrialize the country. And this took a lot of money. But they began to run out in the middle of this modernization process. And now at that point, and the reason they began to run out of money was because England, America, France wouldn't take the ruble in exchange for their goods and services. They would only take hard currencies, which meant the Swiss franc, the British pound, the US dollar, or gold. Now, as the Bolsheviks began to run out of money, which they had seized from the Tsar and from the wealthy, they began to run out. The good news was that there was a lot of hard currency still in Russia in the hands of the citizens who were hiding it under their mattresses, in essence, because they found they could use it very effectively on the black market. So the Bolsheviks came up with this ingenious compromise. They said, okay, we are going to once again open the great hotels and restaurants of Moscow to the citizens of Moscow, provided that when you dine at the Metropol, you pay your bill in foreign currency. And with that compromise, the citizens of Moscow once again had the right to go into the luxury and liberty within inside the walls of the Metropol Hotel, and the Bolsheviks got to rake in the foreign currency which they had been hiding and use that to finish the industrialization of the country.